what exactly is disabling that environment? Because if you ask government, they most likely would say that they're more than willing to create. In fact, they say government is creating an enabling environment. So if we're still saying that government should create an enabling environment, the question would be, what is the cog in the wheel currently that is disabling the environment?
Anyway, you see, the press conference by the Minister of Finance has given us a clear signal that the engagement process between government and the private sector is going to become more intense. And some of these discussions have already commenced. Over the past few days, there's been engagement at very many levels for the private sector and government to work more closely to make sure that this enabling environment we're talking about, we can work it out very quickly and put in place the structures to clear this problem. Now, the power sector has been privatized. There are 11 discos that now in the hands of the private sector. It will be very interesting to see those 11 companies, ownership structure opened up over the next 3 years so that Nigerians who live in the areas where they are serviced can become part owners of these platforms. And the financial system, knowing that these companies have better governance structures, will be in a position to fund them to address problems around power. Because there's no reason why we cannot move from 4,000 megawatts to 50,000 megawatts over the next 3 to 5 years.
Pardon me to butt in, but does that mean that, in fact, I've heard many people say that the power sector may not necessarily come under a short-term plan if we're to improve the situation for now? It has to be a long-term basis. Do you agree with that?
It depends on what you refer to as short-term, medium-term.
Are we going to see any improvements ever since the privatization in the next few years? They keep talking about give us time, but how much time?
I believe the fact that you have more platforms servicing the power sector. You now have a combination of government and the private sector working together. The issues around the power sector, issues around gas, issues around funding, the right kind of funding structures for these companies are already being addressed. So I think in a very, very, very short time, we are going to start seeing improvements. But there are certain steps that will have to be carried out by government and by the private sector. So there's a need for stakeholders in the private sector to better analyze the contents of the minister's press conference. Some of us who have done analysis and we are responding to the message captured in that
You're tightening your belt already.
How is the stock market? You have a
I was going to ask you
of the Chartered Institute of Stockbrokers.
Yeah.
How is the market responding to that? You think that they should be putting in special measures, to ensure that the oil share index continues to do well?
I think the stock market is better organized today than it was in 2008, 2009 when we had issues before. We understand the role of foreign investors. We also understand the role of local investors. We know the gap. 57% is contributed by foreign investors and 43% by local investors. What the structures were put in place now is to see how we can reverse that structure over in the short to medium term, so that when savings is better mobilized, like I said, by insurance and pensions and the capital market through mutual funds, we can have a reversal of that structure where local investors will control a greater percentage of those participating in the capital market. So from 53% against 47%, our target will be to move the market to a situation where 70% is contributed by the local investors and 30% by foreign investors. That way, when you have these shifts, it does not affect the capital market.
Well, so far so good, excuse me. We've been talking about Nigeria beyond oil. We were looking at diversification. It's something that has been mouthed quite often, but we haven't quite seen tangible results or tangible source of funding coming from that diversification, how soon do you think that our efforts at diversification can begin to yield fruits in such a way that we begin to depend less and less on how the crude oil or how crude oil does in the international market?
I think there are a number of markets that we need to review very critically. Solid minerals, the entire process for investing, either by government or the private sector, needs to be looked at, because we have a lot of solid minerals that we are not prospecting.
That will speak to the laws as well, to allow other people coming.
There are operational issues, because a lot of these minerals are being mined in a very crude manner. We need to have these processes modernized so that solid minerals becomes a major contributor. Coal, for example, is a major source for power outside gas and thermal stations. We can get a lot of power out of coal, and investors have already started taking positions, especially in the north central part of Nigeria and the southeast.
You know, a lot of people will argue, because if they're going towards coal, we're talking about environment, climate change, and that's another issue that we need to be bothered about. But the extractive industry, we have gold, we have bauxite, we have all sorts of solid minerals that are yet to be tapped into.
Right.
Do you think there are plans and towards that angle? I mean, even as we're moving away from oil, yes, we've talked agriculture, we've talked about industrialization, the automotive policy. How effective has it been? And yes, we have some motor companies are already setting up their, what they call these plants now that are being put together here in Lagos. Assembly plants. Okay. But what about the extractive industry?
I think the extractive industry will also benefit from the commodities exchange I talked about, because commodities exchange don't only trade agro products. You have commodities exchanges trading solid minerals, products coming out of the extractive industry. Even the commodities exchange platform can also trade electricity. As many more investors start participating in that sector, a market will be created around electricity that is produced. We have a structure at the moment that guarantees most of what is produced by the current structure in the electricity sector. But as the market matures, we're going to get to a point where whatever you produce, you have a market structure that accommodates it.
So you were answering my question. The question will be, how soon do you think that our efforts at diversification will begin to yield fruit?
I think the efforts are already yielding fruit. Just that we have to have the communication structure in government and in the private sector to celebrate some of these early gains. Because it is that celebration that will give rise to many more gains as we take steps to expand the economy. And now, the statement by the Minister of Finance, I believe, is something that the private sector will have to take on. So those of us in the financial system, we need to engage amongst ourselves and identify those things that we must do to grow the financial system. An example is our housing assets across the country. Most of our housing assets across the country are not in the financial system. Young people can't take mortgages. Old people who have invested in assets cannot monetize them. So that is one area that we must address very quickly. If there are laws that need to be passed that will make the creation of mortgages easier for us to accomplish, we must pass those laws. There's from the analysis we have done, there's over 200 trillion naira worth of assets that are not in the financial system.
But from everything that you've recommended here, if they're implemented, how soon do you think they will yield enough funds? Because I think that what is of worry to government is being able to fund the budget it has every year. How soon do you think it will be a substantial part of the funding of that budget?
Now, budget should be a small part of what we need to fund some of these issues. Now, if we engage in identification of PPP opportunities, public partnerships. The projects that cannot be funded by government, the private sector and government can work together to fund. So you don't tie everything to budget. You can fund a new national railway network, for example, without depending on the annual budget, if the right structures are put in place.
You know, speaking about PPPs, there were some cases that people remember that it's not exactly, it didn't leave a pleasant taste in their mouth. The concession of Lagos-Ibadan Expressway and some of the other cases at the airport. At that time, you had a lot of back and forth. They were in court today, they're out tomorrow. Do you think the private sector will be willing to take that step forward, saying, well, yes, we can do this with the government?
I think some of the examples you are giving are examples of concessions that were not properly structured. If you structure concessions properly, you make it as competitive as it should be.
Do you think we've learned from those scenarios?
Oh yes. I believe the one for the revised structure put in place for the Lagos-Ibadan was better structured than the one that was done under the Obasanjo government. The second Niger bridge is being structured by the private sector and government. We need to have many more of those kind of projects structured so that you can get local and international investors participating in covering these gaps. And we can also, some of these resources that we have that we're not utilizing fully, we can leverage resources of government over a long period and get funding to fund some of this critical infrastructure that we're talking about. But with government and the private sector working together to make sure that we get value for money. One of the biggest challenges that we must address going forward is that every naira government spends, I think that's the other message coming out of the minister's speech, we have to be sure that we get value for money invested by government. Because from the private sector perspective, there's a structure that guarantees to a large extent, because of the corporate structures around the private sector, that if you say a project is going to cost 1 billion naira, it's going to cost 1 billion naira.
Most of your perspective has come mostly from your experience as someone in the financial sector. But speaking more generally, as a Nigerian, what would you be looking to see government do in terms of cutting waste? A lot of people say that there's waste in government, and one of the reasons why it's not as efficient as it should be. What would you be looking out to see?
I think what we need to do is to make sure that we have civil society should have better processes for checking how government budgets are structured, how after budget is passed, how the budget is implemented, so that if you have that structure in place, then you have checks and balances to make sure that a lot of areas where you have waste, you curtail it. But I also believe that those who work in government, you also have to have the right compensation structure to make sure that those who work in government do the right thing. I think that is a challenge that we must also address. We must take care of our people who work in government to make sure they deliver the right kind of service.
Okay, I have to thank you for coming on. Mr. Albert Tokumaba is the President and Chairman of Council, Chartered Institute of Stockbrokers. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back after this break. We've got another matter coming up today, in fact, 2 others. So join us again.
Thank you.